Hello and welcome to the Dingometer. It's Friday lunchtime. We bring our sandwiches. Oh, hopefully you do. Phil and I try not to eat on camera, but it's Friday, and welcome to another episode of the Dingometer, our podcast where we investigate ways of creating awesome learning experiences and tackle the tricky issues in learning design. And our guest in this episode is Callum Goodwilliam, whom I'm going to call you, Callum, a learning leader. I hope you're happy with that title. We'll dig into that a little bit through the podcast. But Callum's currently a learning experience consultant and previously held leadership roles in learning-related areas, including learning leader and general program leader at Spotify and senior education program manager at General Assembly. So, Callum, welcome to the podcast. Thank you very much for taking time out of your day to join us today.
Very, very happy to be here. And leader feels very, very generous. But yeah, I love talking about it. And I will also just call out, I heard you say that I previously worked at Spotify. I worked at Shopify, and I spent 3 years there doing exactly the same thing. So, I still do it to this day.
Excellent, good stuff. And welcome, Phil. Thank you for joining us today for the conversation.
No problem. Looking forward to it.
All right, Callum, let's get started. So we chatted a while ago, and it became evident that you had held the sort of some quite senior roles in learning related areas, and this is what first really got my attention because in previous podcasts and over the last few years through our work, Phil and I have talked a lot about the notion of leadership in learning design and what learning designers, it's kind of like what learning designers actually do. And, you know, we reflect on the work that we do as learning designers. And although we're not necessarily in a leadership role, often we end up doing quite a lot of leading through learning design. And it struck me that through some of the roles that you had, you'd probably done that too. So could you perhaps start by telling us a little bit about your journey into these roles? I mean, did you set out to become a learning leader? Like, how did you get to where you got to?
No, I mean, yeah, very good to kind of immediately acknowledge that there wasn't any specific clear game plan about the pathway that I chose. I got some I'm going to credit my mum in the first minute or two of this conversation to say, I got some very good advice, I feel, when I was younger around just the idea of exploring things that excite you, and that obviously these things will change through your career and through your journey, but always trying to keep your opportunities and doors open, right? That was something that was really kind of encouraged, I guess. I felt very lucky in terms of the advice. And so when I started out, I started in a very different space. The beginning of my career was in the nonprofit sector. I did an undergraduate in film and theatre. And so when I kind of first started out, I was working in the nonprofit sector, doing lots of workshop programming and program support, facilitation, working with young people, normally, sometimes in schools, a lot of the time outside of schools. But it was all about basically doing a whole bunch of kind of upskilling and development with the arts as the lens, right? So filmmaking, music workshops, all that kind of stuff. And I did that for a number of years, and I absolutely loved it. And the classic thing of when I decided to do something different and make a change, I didn't realize what I had been gathering along the way in terms of skills and experience, right? So I decided to go and do a master's degree. So I went and studied communications, and through that process, I then decided, like, what was it that I wanted to try and do next, and what was the direction I was going to go in. And that was the point where my other interests, kind of outside of, I guess, the art space, started to cross over. I'd always been really interested in technology, but the classic thing of being like, oh, I really love tech without being a developer or having any of those hard skills. I really have been interested in people and psychology and like learning, and all those things were kind of the things that had been firing for me in the first part of my career. So I got to this point where I was studying, and I looked at the kind of, what could I find a way to kind of bring some of that interest into my study. And so I ended up writing my master's thesis on Google as a case study, as part of the kind of process. And then when I was looking for that next kind of role and opportunity, I came across a learning organization, fantastic organization called Impact International, who were looking for someone to come on board to do basically a kind of a combination of marketing to support and workshop support. It was kind of tangential, right? And I'd done a lot of that kind of stuff in my kind of first kind of chapter of my career, but they were interested, largely in part because one of their clients was Google at the time, and I'd obviously written this thesis, and there was just this like nice overlap. And it brought me into, I guess, the world that I've spent the last nearly 15 years of my career now, right? Which was that kind of opportunity to go into, I guess, corporate learning and training and all the different avenues at which organizations need change and need support and need learning. And I had no real exposure to it up until that point, right? And so going into that, and that I spent a year with them, and which wasn't very long in kind of the grand scheme of things, but it just opened up my eyes and I guess avenues to what was possible. And with that, I guess I was bringing along with me a whole bunch of skills that I'd developed around facilitation, around program support and design and budgeting, all those kinds of like things where when I started to look back, I was like, oh, these were incredibly valuable and transferable as well. So yeah, that took me into, I guess, the corporate world. And that trajectory kind of brought me through into the roles, both eventually then at General Assembly for 5 years and then Shopify for 3 years after that.
That's amazing. And just to say, really interested to hear that your undergrad was in music. I mean, my background was in music as well. And as I've worked in learning roles over the last 3 or 4 years, it's amazing the amount of musicians that I've come across. And there just seems to be a bit of a theme there. But one of the interesting things you mentioned there is this idea of the sort of the skill set that you realized that you perhaps had. And hadn't necessarily intentionally set out to develop, but realised that you had that skill set around sort of budgeting and be able to manage communications and people and marketing. And we had a conversation on a previous podcast with a chap called Matt Dowling, who runs something called the Freelancer Club, and he was looking at very much the freelancer skill set. And it really sounded like a lot there about, there was a lot of similarities there in terms of you have this sort of ability to walk into situations as a creative, you know, with your film and theatre hat on, but you've got these sort of other skills around how to just be organised and be professional and talk to people and manage things and just sort of get on with things. So in your opinion, what would you say are some of the most important skills from that big sort of bucket of skills that you've acquired that have enabled you to succeed and lead in some of these learning focused roles?
For me, and I suppose this is then connecting with the coming from one space and bringing it into another, I think probably one of the biggest ones for me is about pulling inspiration from different places and spaces, like cross-disciplinary thinking and the ways in which you can draw inspiration from different spaces to develop, I guess, a repertoire of frameworks and ideas. And I think also importantly, then start to connect out of specifically learning spheres and into other parts of an organization or into solving business needs and business problems as well. I would say that actually my time at General Assembly, I spent 5 years there. I think that was where that really came alive for me in a very big way. And that's because I came into that organization, again, not coming with a hard set of skills from one of the disciplines that they delivered. So just for a bit of context, General Assembly is an organization, it's an EdTech organization, or historically it came from the kind of the web bootcamp era originally, but grew out into kind of offering a whole range of different upskilling programs across technical disciplines, right? Things that were in high demand across a whole bunch of different industries and organizations. So software engineering, data science, UX design, product design, marketing, all that kind of range of things. And when I first joined, I came in to support the user experience design program. And I came in green, like very fresh. And for me, there was that kind of, lovely mixture of fear, pure fear, and excitement about the possibility, because I knew that what I was doing was working with a bunch of tremendous professionals with deep subject matter expertise across a lot of different areas that I knew very little about. And I had to be able to support, not necessarily know everything about their discipline, but understand the fundamentals and understand how each of the programs ran, what success would look like, what great learning outcomes would look like. So I wouldn't describe it as a baptism of fire, but it was this kind of intense need to learn a lot about these different areas really quickly in a way that would mean that I could support instructors in the classroom and in their support of kind of iterating and designing the curriculum. So very quickly, I was just exposed to an incredible range of really talented, really nice, and really deeply smart people that were just kind of giving me snippets and insights of frameworks and ways of working. And I feel like I was just so lucky just to absorb as much as I humanly could in that time.
That's amazing, and it really reminds me of this concept of imposter syndrome, which I've suffered from in the past. And I've worked with Phil for many years, and Phil was probably the first person to make me aware of this idea. Phil, do you want to, before we get onto this idea of imposter syndrome, what do you want to say a little bit, Phil, about your views on imposter syndrome and why you think it's a useful sort of tool?
Well, I'll just caveat and say that sort of like because as we all become more literate about things, that imposter syndrome has now moved into a sort of into a pro-positive space. So if sort of on LinkedIn, I think it's sort of, and I say this a lot, but it's being hollowed out as we speak. So when I talk about it, I just want to talk about, it's like trying to keep it very real, isn't it? Really. So my experience of, I think imposter syndrome is interesting because people, it vacillates between sort of like, self-esteem, sort of like something that's being done, something that's unconscious and being done unto you in a way, something that's inhibiting. And then there's the other version where it can sort of be turned inside out and become like a torch, or it can become a tool. And my experience of feeling both things at the same time, very, very sort of plainly and sort of acutely, was when I left the higher education sector, and then did my first piece of consultancy work as a communications consultant, in fact, at Amnesty International, so in a completely different space. And I remember sort of literally walking into the headquarters of Amnesty. I hadn't lost my memory of all of my skill sets. I knew, I was old enough and ugly enough to be clear that I wasn't sort of, it wasn't the first day at school, but it also felt exactly like that. And I remember being in my first meeting and sort of like, because if you come in as a consultant, the idea is you're coming in with a kind of a prestige or a power that's been given to you by that job description, because you're meant to be kind of above it and meta and sort of bigger than the brief already, that idea of a consultant. And you go in and actually, my offer, my gift was the fact that I didn't know what the hell anyone was talking about. I just didn't, because how could I know what they were talking about? Because I don't work for this company. I don't know about the company culture. I'm not interested in the fiefdoms. I'm not interested in the rituals because I don't have them. They're not me. So I was there in that weird space, and I'm sure that you know this space, which is to be both smiling and expending energy in mirroring the organization, and at the same time thinking, what the hell is everybody talking about? And why do you do it like that? Why did you all just suddenly nod at this word, which sounds completely mystifying and irrelevant to me? And some of the imposter syndrome is about the way you invert it from feeling afraid to feeling, I guess, useful, is that it just means that you have to ask loads of questions, don't you? You just, and the worst thing is to not ask questions, and to do that thing where you realize that you are pretending to know what's going on. So you're nodding, and then you walk away and you realize that it's all gone horribly wrong on that first day. So for me, that imposter syndrome of, like, literally I could feel it in my hand and had to keep moving this feeling from one hand to the other to say, this is a good thing. This is I'm experiencing some anxiety. Oh no, I'm experiencing some power. And I just moved it from left to right. I don't know if that's commensurate with your own experience of those moments when you start and you have to add value with your imposter syndrome, basically, right?
Yeah. I mean, that connects so deeply for me. And to your question before, Tony, of like, do you experience it? I would say I've experienced it in pretty much every new role that I've moved into, right? And I think that's a good thing in terms of choice and challenge as well, too, right? Which is like, if you're looking for the next thing that will stretch you and push you into either redefining your skills or expanding your skills, if there isn't a little bit of fear there, it's a bit like, I think to your point there, Phil, around kind of anxiety as well. It's the kind of idea that a little bit of anxiety channeled the right way can be something that really helps propel you forward, right? And I'd like to think that in the roles that I've taken, in the times where I've felt that, either new into a role or new into a scenario or situation, it's allowing that to try and help remember that it's pushing you probably into a space where you're learning, or that you've got an opportunity to learn as well too. And I think the other thing that really kind of stands out to me in relation to how you maybe address it or use it is that I think lots and lots of people feel, the more people grow within organizations and the more experience they get, people still feel that, and people still want the obvious questions asked. Like, a number of acronyms. I mean, acronyms are a great example of it, right? Which is like wherever you go somewhere else, you're going to walk into a room full of acronyms and you're not going to know them all. And there are probably other people who've been in that room for ages that still don't know what some of those acronyms mean. And you can then be the one that says, can you just clarify which one this is or what that means? Or like, thank you. And I don't know. I've always found that incredibly valuable when people do it for me. But yeah, I like, to me, a Connect, I often try and think maybe about imposter syndrome and connect it to like beginner's mind, right? Which is beginner's mind is seen as a thing that's really, really positive. The more expert you are at something, the more your opinions calcify, or the fewer possibilities there might be. But beginner's mind is the idea of like endless possibilities. So when you get to walk into that space and potentially frame it as beginner's mind, it's like, I'm here to ask the obvious questions. I think that helps tackle that quite quickly. Or that's at least how I try and think about it.
I think I've never heard those two words put together like that, beginner's mind. And I think it's so interesting because if you were looking in sort of the big book of synonyms, one of the synonyms for imposter syndrome would be beginner's mind, and vice versa, because they are, and yet culturally, you hear it all the time. Certainly in sort of the places where we work and the conversation we have around kind of the growth mindset. And I always, a little part of me dies when I hear that. Not because I die, because I watch that phrase, I watch the impact of that phrase on people, and it's often makes people walk away because it's got this terrible kind of Pollyanna Labrador idea that we're always meant to be sort of leaning into anxiety and sort of desperately trying to sort of decalcify our boundaries. And actually, and this is working up to a question around your really about learning design in organizations and sort of how you facilitate learning, because without generalizing, my experience of organizations and people who suddenly discover that perhaps there's more learning to be done in their role, there are people who run into that space with their growth mindset and their beginner's mind, and they're terribly excited about that. But also you sort of see organizational cultures where it's very hard to land learning with people, very, very hard to land, particularly if people aren't at school anymore and they're in their job descriptions and they're in their expertise space. So because you're talking hugely positively there, as I think learners and people who do this work do, around just learning as a thing that we all agree on is good, and the beginner's mind is good, and like the growth mindset is good. But I have a lot of experiences of people who might say that out loud, but secretly have got their arms crossed. And I just wonder about your how you've produced influence, encouragement, how you facilitate that in the minds of people who perhaps aren't as excited about learning as perhaps this company is, as we are.
Yeah, it's I think you're absolutely right. I think that's been when I thread that kind of line of connection as to why did I get into this work. One of the threads that I ended up pulling on and not really realizing was I had a wonderful time. It's the classic thing. I had a wonderful time at primary school. I remember that being an amazing experience. I felt I had a really hard time at secondary school for various reasons. And I felt like it nearly kind of like sucked that joy out of me. And I felt like I got through the kind of other side of it. And then it really started to reignite for me from college into university. And then by the time I went to go and do the masters again, I was like back there. And I was like, well, this is kind of what I want to pursue. And this is the direction I want to go in. But the thread that I then became very interested in is like, well, lots and lots of people get really put off by difficult experiences in learning, in work. And that kind of view like calcifies. Again, I use that word, but different context, but like people become resistant. And for me, I think the why of doing any of this is that to try and help people like undo that or soften that and give everyone more opportunity to find work that matters to them, work that pays well, work that helps grow their ambitions and what they want out of life. Like that's where I see the value of learning as a function within organizations, right? But to meet those people where they are, or to meet people within organizations where learning is not their priority, you have to be thinking in their language and you have to be thinking from their worldview, right? So for me, I love learning theory. I'm always very interested to talk to people who are like obsessed with it and know often way more than I do, just to learn from it. But I'm also really interested in trying to understand the language of other parts of the organization. I think specifically, again, back to what I started to learn at General Assembly, and it really kind of informed my time at Shopify, was what are the other type parts of like quintessential or essential parts of modern organizations, right? And when you're looking at product-led organizations and tech-led organizations, understanding their language, understanding what matters, and understanding the performance problems they are trying to solve. I think that for me is where it becomes, that's where the connection with learning is. It's like, what are they trying, what matters most to them? What are the performance problems that it might exist connected to that? And how might we speak to them so that we are addressing what they're most worried about and what they're focused on? And if you can do that through a combination of using their language and digging into their problems with them, I think that's where it's much more about a strategic intervention or strategic changes, where learning teams, organizations, individuals can really make the difference.
You mentioned this idea of a learning product there, which for me was quite a new term. And when I left higher education, I'd never even heard the term learning products until I started building them and realized that, oh, higher education is basically, a collection of courses, a learning product. But through the experiences that Phil and I have had at Ding, we've seen the different facets or the different skill sets people that are required to build a learning product. But in your opinion, and based on your experience, how much do you think learning designers have to or should be in a leading role to build a successful learning product? Because often learning designers can be quite downstream. We often use some sort of downstream and upstream, and you strike me as someone who's quite upstream in terms of the ability to influence. But often learning designers are sort of, they're over here and someone's made a decision that they're going to build this product, and they give it to the learning designers over here and they just build the product. But actually, if those learning designers were involved a bit earlier on and could ask a bit more, some more influential questions, perhaps you'd get a better product. But what's your view on the role of learning designers in building successful learning products, and where should they, or how should they be best brought into that process?
I think that's it's a really interesting question, but I suppose maybe I'll put one back to you both as the starting point around what do we mean by lead and what do we mean by leadership? Because, and obviously there's an entire industry is built around the language, but I'm really curious as to how you both feel about it and what your kind of definitions or perspective is, because once you start with that, then I think that's kind of how I would then approach.
Well, I mean, again, I'm, for me, my personal frustrations in this space. So, for example, back in the day, when I used to be in higher education, so I was a course leader, and that's only important because course leaders have a level of autonomy, and not all course leaders necessarily want that level of autonomy, I suppose, because for me, my impact and my success lived in the fact that I was autonomous, because essentially various restructures had stripped out a lot of other people. So in terms of budget and timetabling, the ability, you talked, I think, very interestingly about understanding the whole organization. And I think the problem sometimes in HE is that course leaders and academics don't try and understand the whole organization because they're looking at their subject. But because essentially we've been stripped out in so many different ways, the links to budget, resources, rooms, marketing, recruitment, there's the sense that you had all of these other dependencies that were a part of your role. I mean, that was always front, that I was always very clear, but it produced a kind of autonomy too, because you could start to make these quite contextualized decisions and you could start to see the impact of stuff. And you were, so I hate the idea of tinkering. I hate the idea of tinkering because it is energy and it's expenditure of energy, but it is to keep things the same, or to sort of, and yet it's the performance of leadership. Sometimes it's a performative thing, not the actual activity of the job. And so I grew used to being a strong leader because I wasn't tinkering, because I was able to make strategic choices all the way from structuring the course in relationship to a credit framework, or producing experiences or changing the casting of which characters students were meeting at level 4, or all of those things. And so you were able to convene and produce an experience because you were upriver, and you also had the context and the autonomy to deliver something, to enact your ideas in a space. Whereas I've been in situations since where perhaps we've been asked to do some learning design, and you know that you are actually a long way downriver and you are dealing with baked in problems, or that you are inheriting some learning outcomes, or inheriting a culture where the learning has been built around deficit, or the learning has kind of is scaffolding an existing organizational issue, and you are there being asked to sort of repeat it, duplicate it, and all of those things. And so for me, leadership is sort of like to be not tinkering. It's a non-tinkerer's charter. It's that. I think tinkering for me, and tinkering is a small word to describe, I think, a lot of activity that isn't moving the needle at all, and just perpetuating a culture, perpetuating sameness. And yet, if you were to perhaps talk to everybody in that space, they know that's what's happening. And there's a kind of a weird fatalism about it. It's like, we're going to do this activity. People are going to stand up and learn. Nothing's going to change. It doesn't really work. No one's really interested, but we're going to do it again. It's like, oh. And I don't like being in that space, because that feels to be like it seems like a terrible waste of time and a non-leadership space, really. So that's my take on it. Tinkering is like my synonym for like, you know.
I'll just give you another very quick sort of product-focused example. We've had quite a few of these experiences recently where we've been brought in as a learning design team and given a very loose brief. It's like, we need this thing. It needs to do this. It's, you know, but the brief is literally, you know, 2 pages of A4, and yet this is a, you know, a multi-thousand-pound learning product. And so we've had to lead. We've had to basically walk into that, ask all the questions, figure out what the strategic fit is, who's this for, how much money are they going to spend, where are they, have you thought about this, have you thought about that? And it's like, you just think, wow, hang on, not with just learning designers, but clearly you suddenly realize that you're having to do a lot of the strategic thinking if this product is going to be successful. And I suppose in your experience, you've worked in multiple learning teams and built multiple learning products. So where is the role of the learning designer in that? And in your experience, are learning designers in the conversations early enough to ensure these learning products are successful, I suppose?
Yeah, I think your point around where you have to step in and provide that kind of strategic support or be driving that strategy, that's actually one of the things I'm so excited. So I've just joined the team at Sponge. I'm super excited to kind of get involved in everything that they're doing, because for me, and what seems incredibly clear in the products and what they're building, is leading with that strategic focus. And for me, again, a thread that kind of comes across the other places that I've been in, and I guess other frameworks associated with leadership that I've seen over the years, is that I think one of the ways I really like to think about it is as an action. And this is not mine. This was from the organization that I mentioned earlier on, Impact. A whole bunch of fantastic practitioners there, and lots of different approaches to kind of behavior change and leadership. But one of the frameworks that they introduced to me, which I felt was very powerful, was the idea of leadership as an action, right? And something that can be done at any phase or stage of your career, in any team and in any level of hierarchy. And therefore it's removed from personality type or attributes or all of that kind of thing, but it is focused on very clearly being able to identify what is missing from a team project. And that whole kind of bunch of variables that you could explore to kind of try and identify what might be missing. And at the point you notice that it's missing, making the decision to do something about it. And that relies on courage. And for me, I would say, out of all the different types of leaders and the different types of conversations I've had with people, and people I've been very inspired by over the years, it's that notion of courage, which I think is the thing that encapsulates a lot of what you were talking about there, Phil, around tinkering around the edges or going through the motions with something, and somebody actually stopping and saying, this is a waste of time. Like, and someone needs to say it. And normally that person is being exceptionally brave. Like really, they are. And like either they're putting their role on the line, their credibility on the line, whatever it is. But often they're not being, they'll probably find quite quickly that other people feel the same. And that how you create the conditions within teams and in organizations where people feel that it's not a big moment of bravery, that you can actually do that easily and quickly. I think that's the kind of connecting thread, which is how do we support learning designers, people across teams to be able to have that bravery, to be able to speak up and be able to help basically solve better problems, right? Actually really get into the heart of something rather than surface, like sticking bandages or whatever it is, just like, again, doing the same thing because that's what we've done or that's what we've been handed.
I mean, I'd absolutely, it's interesting to hear you talk about courage, because courage has this sort of, it's one of those big words, isn't it? It's a big sort of, it feels like we need a suit of armor and a dragon. But courage is a funny thing because when you're about to, I always know when I'm about to reach for my courage. And I can, just to bring it back to sort of amnesty, I remember the night after my first day, and I've been brought in as a communications consultant, and the brief had been written in a particular way. And I sat with that brief at home, and I realized that the brief was written to reproduce the status quo, not in some conspiracist way, not in some because anybody who'd written it was stupid. It was because it was written within the rituals of the way they ask for things in that space. So they were asking for something, and it was what they wanted. Except I knew that the next day I was going to go in and say, I think I'm either wrong for this or this is wrong, and this is why. And I remember I did a presentation, and I remember I could feel myself reaching into my, I don't know where it was, and going, here we go, here we go, here we go. And it's not like this is like it's not like sort of like it's not a filmic moment, but I can always feel when you are reaching into that space. And I don't know if there's ever going to be a time when it doesn't feel the way it does when you're about to do it, because it's often around a challenge to a kind of some unwritten rules or a company ritual or something that's kind of, not in the constitution exactly. It's sort of in the kind of a broad understanding. But I think leadership is an act of courage, because I think there is leaders where it's not courageous because it is about the presentation of leadership, which is, again, as I think that's why you said, basing it on action is a very clear attribute for spotting it when it's happening. Because I know I've known a number of leaders who are sort of, what's the word, all light and no heat. I think that's the phrase, isn't it? Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a very interesting, very graspable idea about what it feels like to lead, which is as an attribute of courage. Interesting.
Can I ask you, Callum, because you mentioned earlier, and I didn't realise till we spoke that, say, your undergrad was in film and theatre, and I mean, both Phil and my background is in creative disciplines, but I hadn't really perhaps made that connection as much until you mentioned it. But how much do you think your training in film theatre and your ability to sort of just thinking about performance, I suppose, in a disciplinary context, how much does that, or has that helped you navigate this context? Because I mean, Phil and I talk a lot about creative learning design as opposed to just learning design, and obviously you always get challenged on what is the creative bit, what's the role of creativity in any of this. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts, because you obviously had a creative background, a training in film theatre. Do you find yourself consciously reaching for that, or are you aware of its influence on how it's driven you forward and in areas of your professionalism?
For sure. And I would say definitely more so in the first stages of that transition. I think when I moved across into specifically into facilitation, I would say 100%, like getting to spend time with groups of people and being able to kind of do that exploration and support and coaching and I don't know, being in a room with people. I had very fond memories actually of when I first started at General Assembly. One of the components specifically for the UX program was about supporting people go through the process of pitching and talking through their work and standing in front of a group of people and delivering with coherence and clarity and storytelling and all that kind of stuff. And I couldn't add any specific. I was always present to kind of watch these presentations, and they were always critiqued by our fabulous instructors that had deep industry experience. I couldn't add any value from a framework or methodology perspective, but I could talk to them about the fundamentals of how that pitching process came across, what they could do differently, small things about body language and how we hold ourselves and what makes a difference into our voice and our work. And it was a joy at that point to be able to feel like I could help people in sometimes small ways, but sometimes kind of maybe more substantial ways, just drawing lots of little elements and all of that stuff. So 100%, when I look back at it, I think it was so helpful. But the main thread around, I guess, all of that time, and again, I guess across multiple creative practices, is that the kind of the notion of play, right? And play is bandied around a lot as well in terms of when we talk about it in learning sphere, and there, for me, there's a danger of it being overutilized, a bit like you were saying earlier, Phil, around growth mindset. Lots of it can be too much potentially, but I tend to refer back to the kind of when I partook in those, like the arts and those kinds of activities, I explored a lot of improvisation and that notion of fear and play and failure, and all of those things I still feel like I draw upon regularly. Like, yeah, absolutely.
What's really interesting is because again, I'm thinking synonymously there, because you talked about play as being a synonym for doing things without a clear brief or clear boundary. And so when you do things without a clear brief and boundary, you're dealing with uncertainty. Uncertainty is the production of fear, all of those things. But play doesn't feel fearful. It feels like the absence of fear. In that's why people always that is why it's been hollowed out, because people talk about it. It's and what they're trying to say is that we should all play more, and what they're really saying is we should all just try things more without fear of failure. And yet the very fact that we have to keep being reminded of it, and it gets and again calcified into kind of a list on LinkedIn about the attributes for the 21st century, whatever it may be. It's obviously that play gets harder as you get older. Play is, because play is what children do, and it's sort of the innate condition of learning when you're a child, and then we become these sort of older people, and suddenly all that stuff gets more difficult. But Tony and I have done a lot recently, and then continue to have a lot of conversations about doing, like the doing things. So leading with doing, learning by doing, and doing, I feel like is synonymous with play. Because and we've done there's been lots of stuff recently around AI and AI coming to replace particular types of knowledge and how that knowledge is produced and so on and so forth. And this notion that actually, and then you look at the employers talking about the skills gap and what graduates particularly don't have when they leave, and it's so fascinating, because it's always like, we need young people to be better at dealing with ambiguity, uncertainty. We need more resilience in the face of unpredictability. And it's like, I'm hearing the word play. I'm hearing the word doing. I'm hearing that, and it goes round and round and round. So again, it's very interesting to hear you align sort of like that. You're drawing upon your even when you use the word improvisation, I think about sort of those, I didn't do theatre, I did film and storytelling, but that notion of improvisation, which is absolutely the expression of responding in context while active listening in a space that's unpredictable, if you know what I mean. It's like you've just described life. Life. So again, it's fascinating to see you drawing upon that, because that doesn't seem interdisciplinary. That seems like it's just it's word salad, but it's like, the ability to get, like in your role, to facilitate the conditions for people in organizations to feel that they can play /learn /risk, right?
Yes.
So would you say that's a key maneuver for you?
That's a lovely summary. That really is a lovely summary, and it is exactly the philosophy that has underpinned how I've thought about building teams, working with others, and especially when you're trying to think about people's development and growth. Is that how do you create? Again, lots of it overlaps, right? Is If you want to create the conditions for people to grow and push themselves in their career, you're trying to find the overlap between what they're most interested in or where they really want to excel with what the business needs. So can you find those opportunities where they overlap? How do you find out about what people want? Well, they need to be able to talk about it openly and honestly. So how do you enable those kinds of conversations, not just with yourself if you're leading a team, but across the team, so that you can look for opportunities to pair people together against strengths or look for opportunities for them to work on projects together? Exactly. And if you can do all of that around the kind of space of letting people trying to create the conditions where people are enjoying the work that they're doing, that's where you get people being playful. And that's where people start to build trust. In my experiences, that's where trust grows fastest. And of course, all of that is within the shadow of things you cannot control within an organization context, right? And mandates and expectations and team pressures and changes and all of that stuff comes with it. But for what you can control, if you're able to build those things, that's for me where I've felt supported and grown the most. And it's where I think when I've worked with others, I've been able to do my best work, helping them achieve what they want to as well too.
And I just linked all of that, earlier, that's the thing around not tinkering and sort of what autonomy and what that feels like. I think now, if I reflect on the kind of team that I had a great team. So I wasn't sort of like a solo flyer. I had a great team, and I think that playfulness and the sense that we could try new things, and that there was a sense. I do feel that the idea that the team felt playful. Thinking about it now is I think is a synonym I haven't used before to describe the effectiveness of how we rolled, and how we sort of produced the successes that we did, which was, I think, that there was a sense that people could invent. And of course, you're looking at in that world, you're looking at a place with loads of things that couldn't be changed, alignments that had to be maintained. So it wasn't a free for all. But I think, as I said before, because in that learning space, and it's what you said about understanding all the different departments, and not being an island, that you could actually play in a literate way, because you kind of knew what was coming down the pipe, and you had this three-dimensional sense of what the business was worrying about, and and that bizarrely produced freedom to play. I think that's probably true.
Can I ask you, Callum, you mentioned this idea of learning teams, and we sort of got into the idea of teamwork and what you need to be in a successful team. And obviously through your career, you've worked in a number of learning teams and led learning teams. As I expect. Can I ask, in your opinion, how do you build and lead a successful learning team in a business? And I know that's a big question, but often learning teams get siloed, or they expand, or they contract. But if you sort of aggregate your experience, when you've been in a successful learning team in a business, what's made it successful? What are some of the key things that have made it a successful learning function, if you like?
I think having a very specific mandate often is the most powerful thing, right? Regardless of what stage or phase you join an organization, if the mandate from the business is very clear about what they're trying to achieve, that gives you solid foundations, I think. Absolutely. That for me is where I've felt best in the work. It's like, if we know what it is that we're trying to solve and we know what great will look like, then we are traveling in that direction, right? And that's what we do. And then we can build and assemble the team around that. In terms of, I guess, the nuance of that for me has always been, because I've worked across a lot of technical learning, I have always wanted to build out people around me that complement it's that kind of classic thing of drawing on people that you think you'll work well with, but absolutely strengthening your gaps or areas that you're going to need more expertise and specific depth. Building that kind of breadth of understanding and knowledge across the learning team as well, and interest, right? Again, if you have people, again, I felt very lucky, particularly in my last role at Shopify. It's like I worked with such an incredible number of incredibly smart, really nice people with tons of different deep expert knowledge that also then spanned across different industries, different lines of work. And really that gave you so much scope to look outwards in different ways, because I didn't need to do it myself directly. You just had that innate interest from different people across the organization with intense interest and skills that were just looking out at opportunities and ways to connect and to build relationships and to spot problems worth solving. And then it's a question of depending on your mandate, if your mandate is very clear, you might have one very specific task or problem that you're there to solve. But if that changes, and if you're then starting to look at what are the other problems that we might be able to solve, then those people looking outwards across the organization and building those relationships into different spaces will be listening and will have their eyes and ears open and will be able to surface things that as one individual, you're never going to be able to do alone. But I think it's that kind of almost like grassroots looking out, whilst also then being able to really connect in with leadership across the organization and be able to then combine the two, right? You're always going to need that kind of mandate and drive from senior leadership, but can you also kind of look out across the needs across the business?
Can I ask you a quick question? Sorry, Tony, I know you've already got one lined up, but it's about to refer to your courage idea and leadership, which is that because what you've expressed there is that one of the ways that sort of will facilitate success in terms of teams and sort of like producing something is that when the mandate is clear. Some of my experiences tell me that when I've had to reach in, and and do the courage piece, is often because you've walked into a space and there is no mandate. So that's the moment where because I think from a sort of a learning design point of view, that once you have a learning outcome and everyone's agreed on that, then sometimes it's a question of like, okay, then you just produce the experiences that will deliver on that outcome, and that becomes very straightforward. That's people can sort of aggregate around that. I think a lot of times with clients, or organizations, they often use that dispersal of mandate for you go in and you help them kind of figure out what it is they meant when they asked for X, and sometimes that can feel terribly that can feel like tinkering, because it can feel a little bit like, is it this, is it this, is it this, is it this? So in terms of have you ever been in situations or anecdotally other people where leadership begins with your ability to enact your leadership begins with having those courageous conversations around the mandate, around that's the bit where you get up river. It's that point.
Yeah, for sure. I think it is one of the trickiest things, and I would say that I've probably had as many failures, or maybe I could have done more, or I should have done more in that moment. As a lot of reflection and introspection about where could I have been braver, or what might I have done differently that could have pushed that change faster, or maybe got into the right conversation with people. But to me, it often comes back to and it's the balance between like courageous or bravery and foolhardy as well, right? Like, you're walking a really fine tightrope there, and do you necessarily know that what you're going to do? Yes, exactly. Is it the right move? Undoubtedly. But yeah, I think it's something that I think I'll continue to try and get better at for the rest. I don't think I'll ever stop trying to improve, trying to understand that and knowing when to do that.
But I definitely think there's this sweet spot. You started off, we talked about acronyms and people having to sort of like say, sorry, what does that mean? I think certainly my experience has often been that in that role of, in the role of the imposter and in the role of literally just asking the idiot question, that is where in that moment, you can bring challenge to a status quo without it being because if you're bringing it in terms of a question, it's sort of like, could you just help me understand, if we're going to build some consensus going forward, why is it that this is so important in your organize? And it's so I do think that one of the consultative spaces where the imposter is absolutely the torch and very useful that's where you can produce some challenge at the same time as you are trying to build consensus, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Trying to figure out if we're all on the same page. And I think if you don't ask those questions, you heighten the chances that you are in a conga, that you've just come in to repeat history in that sense.
Yeah, you've joined the end of the line.
You're at the end of the line. You've just joined the end of the line. So I think the imposter thing is really very powerful, if you can turn it around, as opposed to just experience it, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Last question, Callum. I'm conscious of time. We work with a lot of younger learning designers or people transitioning from HE or other disciplines who want to become learning designers. Based on your experience, if you could give one piece of advice to a learning designer who wants to get more upriver, who wants to progress into more senior roles, what would that be? How might a learning designer who can see the potential of what they can do or their discipline, but they're struggling to get upriver, to get more recognition, but just to have more of an impact,
to exert more influence, to make good stuff happen. You know?
I think it's always a combined tactic for me. I think my single advice would be taking a two-pronged approach, right? Which is, the more you can deepen your craft expertise, and not specifically by tool or one specific methodology approach, whatever. Like, the more you can deepen your craft expertise and be seen as an SME in what you do and produce brilliant work, the more people will notice that work, right? Inevitably. But I would always caveat that with not at the expense of people and communication skills. Like, it shouldn't have to be an either or. It can be a yes and, right? Or yes, both. Like, the best people that I've ever worked with have had that lovely combination of being incredibly passionate and interested about their specific craft, but also recognize that whether you want to frame it as management or whether you want to frame it as leadership, whatever, or communication, they have had it like abilities across that space. And it's not, no one, I don't believe, is perfectly rounded in all of the many things that can make great managers and great leaders, but you have to have some kind of interest or spark in it. And I don't know, I think there's changing tides at the moment in the industry around, like, there's less demand or interest in managers. A lot of organizations are trying to flatten and remove those structures, right? And so therefore competition for those kinds of roles is probably higher. You need to have more there, or have developed your interests there too. So I think it's always going to be a combination of those two things. And I would say probably the best way you can get it is by mentorship. Like, for me, and when I say mentorship, I don't mean like capital M mentorship, that you go to someone and say, hello, would you possibly be my mentor? Let's, design a program or time. No, like, yes, of course you can do that. And there are plenty of people that be very willing to engage with it. But I think just knowing that mentorship can be very informal as well too. And I could write down a long list of the people that have been either peers or distant people across organizations right the way across my career, where I have just wanted to get on calls with them and listen to them talk without me ever using the word mentorship, because they've got the things that I know I want to know how to do more of, and to tell those people. I think maybe that's the last thing I'll end on, is tell people why you value them and what it is that speaks to you or inspires you, or just that you see them doing incredibly well and you want to know how they think about it or do it. I don't know whether it's a particularly British thing, but certainly I think about it. I think a lot of people don't tell people what they appreciate enough. And I think just doing that, to actually telling them, and as long as you really mean it, it's amazing how much willingness people have to give in terms of time and energy, and just to talk about their experiences. I think that comes very easily for a lot of people. So look for mentorship opportunities in any which way you can to really try and allow you to go deep on the skills, both across your craft and across people.
Callum, Phil, thanks so much for joining us today. And Nick, Callum, thank you so much for sharing your experience in these range of roles, and lots to take away there, and sort of lots for us to process in terms of advice for, I suppose, learning designers coming into the profession, and also people who've been quite established in terms of how you continue to stay energized and motivated in your role. So thank you both for sharing your advice, and really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.